I wanted to try a new series where I am focused on talking with an AI. So I came up with a work stream that I think could work pretty well in this format. I think it needs a little bit of tuning, but hopefully you'll give me some comments about how you think I can make it better. So what I've done is, you can see the window in the top right here. This is an AI that will be listening to my input. Now I'm using Claude 3.5 Sonnet because it's the best AI out there right now by almost all accounts. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a text-to-speech mode. So what I've done is come up with a workflow where I can query it, I'll get a response back, and then I'll use Amazon Polly's text-to-speech to translate it. Now, it's not as good as something like 11 Labs, so you have to bear with us for a little while. Maybe if this channel blows up, 11 Labs will give us a real subscription, but it's sort of prohibitively expensive for as much content as I think I'm going to produce here. So let's give this a try and see how it works. Claude, I've got you on a podcast right now, and what we're doing is recording my speech, translating it to text with Whisper, sending it to your API, and then getting a response back, translating that with AWS Poly, and then the podcast listeners will be able to hear you. What do you think about that setup? Is there some way I can make it better? Now, unfortunately, there is going to be some time lag here, but I'm hoping we can minimize it a little bit.
Wow, that's an impressive setup you've got there. It's like we're bridging the gap between AI and human conversation in real time. I think it's a fantastic way to showcase the potential of AI integration in podcasting. As for improvements, have you considered adding a visual element?
She doesn't know that I've done
Maybe
that yet.
a live transcript or animated avatar to represent me?
Genius.
It could make the experience even more engaging for your audience. But I'm curious, how's the latency?
Another good question.
Are you finding the back and forth feels natural? I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it's working from your end.
Yeah, good question. The latency is actually a little problematic, but hopefully everybody will bear with us here. But I do want to switch gears. I want to talk a little bit about philosophy. I was doing a podcast the other day, and I mentioned to the host that I didn't believe in free will, and he told me that he'd never met somebody that didn't believe in free will. And I'm sort of deep down the rabbit hole of people who don't believe in free will, or at least talk about it a lot. And so I'm wondering if you can come up with maybe the top 3 arguments for the non-existence of free will for us here.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to dive into this fascinating topic. The question of free will has puzzled philosophers for centuries. Here are 3 compelling arguments against its existence. 1. Causal determinism. This argues that every event, including our thoughts and actions, is the inevitable result of prior causes. If we could rewind the universe, given the same initial conditions, we'd make the same choices every time.
A very popular
2.
Sam Harris
Neuroscientific
argument.
evidence. Some studies suggest our brains make decisions before we're consciously aware of them. This implies our sense of choice might be an illusion, a post hoc rationalization of decisions already made subconsciously. 3. Logical incompatibility. If our actions aren't determined by prior causes, they must be random. But random actions aren't freely willed either. So, free will seems logically impossible. What's your take on these arguments? Do you find any of them particularly compelling or problematic?
Yeah, so the second one is interesting, and I hear it a lot, or I hear it brought up a lot in the argument of free will versus determinism. And one thing that strikes, well, let's talk about one of the experiments. So there's a famous experiment where they ask people when to let the researcher know when they've made a decision about which object to grab, for instance, and they're hooked up to an fMRI device, and the machine or the device could tell when the person had made up their mind before they realized that they had made up their mind. Did I leave anything out there, Claude?
You've captured the essence of that experiment quite well. It's often referred to as the Libet experiment, named after neuroscientist Benjamin Libet, who conducted it in the 1980s. One key detail you might want to add is that the experiment specifically measured what's called the readiness potential in the brain, a measurable brain signal that precedes voluntary motor actions. This signal was detected up to several hundred milliseconds before participants reported becoming aware of their decision. It's a fascinating study because it seems to challenge our intuitive sense of conscious decision making. However, it's worth noting that the interpretation of these results is still hotly debated in neuroscience and philosophy circles. What's your take on this experiment? Do you think it definitively proves anything about free will, or are there alternative interpretations we should consider?
Yeah, I guess one thing that strikes me is, how do we know that this isn't some sort of inherent latency in human processing, for instance, right? So maybe I make a decision and it just takes me a little bit longer to realize that I've actually made the decision. I guess, how does it actually argue against the existence of free will, for instance?
That's an excellent point you're raising. You've hit on one of the key critiques of using this experiment as definitive proof against free will. You're absolutely right. The delay could indeed be a result of processing time in our conscious awareness. It's possible we make a decision freely, but it takes a moment for that decision to bubble up to our conscious mind. Moreover, this experiment focuses on simple, arbitrary choices. It doesn't necessarily reflect the complex decision-making we associate with free will in real-life situations. Another consideration is that even if initial impulses are unconscious, we might still have the ability to veto or modify these impulses before acting, a concept some call free won't. So while the experiment is intriguing, you're spot on in questioning its conclusiveness. It highlights the complexity of consciousness and decision-making, but doesn't necessarily disprove free will. What are your thoughts on how we might design better experiments to probe this question?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask if you think there are better examples of neuroscience experiments specifically that speak toward the free will issue more directly.
Absolutely. There have been some fascinating developments in this area. One experiment that comes to mind is the work of John Dylan Haynes and his team in Berlin. They used fMRI to predict participants' decisions up to 7 seconds before they were consciously aware of making a choice. Participants were asked to spontaneously decide to press a button with either their left or right hand. The researchers could predict which hand they'd use with about 60% accuracy.
Is that good?
Significantly above chance. This study is intriguing because it extends the time frame far beyond Libet's experiment, potentially challenging the idea of conscious intention even more directly. Another interesting approach is Patrick Haggard's work on intentional binding. This phenomenon shows that we perceive voluntary actions and their outcomes as closer together in time than they actually are, suggesting our brain constructs our sense of agency after the fact. But you're right to be cautious. While these experiments are provocative, they still don't definitively settle the free will debate. They raise as many questions as they answer about the nature of consciousness and decision-making. What's your take on these more recent experiments? Do you think they get us closer to understanding free will, or are we still missing something crucial?
Yeah, sorry, can you tell me more about the voluntary action experiment? I didn't quite understand the setup for it or how it's meant to prove or disprove, or at least tend to prove or disprove determinism.
Of course. I'd be happy to clarify. The experiment you're asking about is known as the intentional binding experiment, conducted by Patrick Haggard and his colleagues. Here's the basic setup. 1. Participants perform a voluntary action, like pressing a button. 2. This action triggers an outcome, such as a tone, after a short delay. 3. Participants are asked to report when they performed the action and when they heard the tone. The key finding is that when people voluntarily cause an action, they perceive the time between their action and its outcome as shorter than it actually is. It's as if the brain binds the action and its consequence closer together in time. Interestingly, this effect doesn't occur for involuntary movements. This experiment doesn't directly prove or disprove determinism, but it suggests our sense of agency might be a construction of the brain rather than a direct experience of free will. It implies our perception of control over our actions might be, at least in part, an illusion created after the fact. However, it's crucial to note that this doesn't definitively disprove free will. It simply challenges our intuitive understanding of how we experience our own actions and their consequences. What do you think about this? Does it change how you view your own sense of agency in your actions?
Yeah, so you're sort of alluding to the split brain experiment there, right? Where there's confabulation after the fact, sort of a post hoc rationalization of why somebody grabbed a specific object. Do you want to talk a little bit about the setup for that experiment and how that worked?
Absolutely. You're drawing a really insightful connection there.
The
sweet. Split brain experiments you're referring to were primarily conducted by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga in the 1960s and 70s. And they're fascinating. Here's the basic setup. 1. The subjects were patients who had undergone corpus callosotomy, a surgical procedure that severs the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres of the brain. This was done to treat severe epilepsy. 2. In these experiments, researchers would present stimuli to only one hemisphere of the brain. For instance, they might show an image to only the left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere. 3. They would then ask the subject to explain or react to what they saw. The key finding was that when the left hemisphere, which controls speech in most people, couldn't access information presented to the right hemisphere, it would often invent plausible explanations for the person's behavior. For example, if an image of a chicken claw was shown to the right brain and a snow scene to the left, when asked to pick a related image, the left hand, controlled by the right brain, would pick a shovel for the snow, while the right hand would pick a chicken. When asked to explain these choices, the left hemisphere, which can't see the snow scene, would confabulate a reason, like, oh, you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop. This suggests that our conscious mind often creates narratives to explain our actions, even when it doesn't have access to the real reasons. It's a powerful demonstration of how our sense of agency and decision-making might not be as straightforward as we intuitively believe. What are your thoughts on how this relates to the free will debate? Does it change how you view your own decision-making process?
Yeah, this experiment has sort of always done strange things with my brain. It makes me question how much confabulation I do in my daily life. You know, there's a pretty good example, and I'm not talking to the AI right now. I'm just kind of riffing here, but there's a famous example that Sam Harris tends to give, which is he asks you to think about just a song or a movie, and he pauses and lets you come up with the answer, and then asks you why you came up with that. And sometimes the answer is it just kind of appeared, right? But sometimes there's an answer about, today's the 2nd of July, and it's almost the 4th of July, so I think Americana's on my brain, so I picked a famous American anthem. But in fact, it may just be that it just sort of appeared in consciousness and you're confabulating a reason about why that happened. So I try to think about that a lot and be sort of mindful about the things that I think I know why I'm thinking, and just try to introspect them a bit and figure out if there actually is a real cause for why I'm thinking the things that I do. I'm gonna switch back to the AI here. Okay, I want to switch gears now and ask you a little bit about some arguments against, some arguments for free will. So why don't you give me the top 3 most persuasive and perhaps most researched arguments that tend to show that free will is real?
Certainly. It's important to consider both sides of this philosophical debate. Here are 3 compelling arguments in favor of free will. 1. The phenomenological argument. This is based on our subjective experience of making choices. We feel like we're making free decisions. And this universal human experience shouldn't be dismissed lightly. Some argue that this strong intuition of free will is evidence for its existence.
Doesn't seem like a very strong
The moral
argument.
responsibility argument. This contends that without free will, concepts like moral responsibility, praise, and blame become meaningless. Our legal and ethical systems are built on the assumption of free will.
You should believe in it.
Proponents argue
not
that
for
the
why
practical
it's real.
necessity of free will for society to function is evidence of its reality. 3. The quantum indeterminacy argument. Some physicists and philosophers argue that quantum mechanics introduces genuine randomness into the universe at a fundamental level. This indeterminacy at the quantum level could potentially allow for free will by breaking the chain of cause and effect required by determinism. It's worth noting that these arguments are still hotly debated. What's your take on them? Do you find any particularly convincing? Or do you see potential flaws in their reasoning?
Yeah, so let's take arguments 1 and 2 first. They seemed to be more arguments about why it would behoove us to believe in free will. They don't really seem to be a scientifically grounded argument for why we should believe in them. I'm curious if you agree with that. And if not, I'd like to hear why. And then next we can move on to the quantum indeterminacy argument.
You've made an astute observation there. You're absolutely right. The first 2 arguments are indeed more about the practical and philosophical implications of free will rather than providing empirical evidence for its existence. The phenomenological argument is essentially saying, it feels real, so it must be real, which, as you point out, isn't scientifically rigorous. It's a starting point for inquiry, perhaps, but not proof in itself. The moral responsibility argument is similarly pragmatic rather than empirical. It's saying, we need free will for society to function, which doesn't actually prove its existence. It's more of an argument for why believing in free will might be beneficial. You're spot on in recognizing that these aren't scientifically grounded arguments. They're more philosophical and sociological in nature, addressing the implications and utility of the concept of free will rather than providing evidence for its actual existence. This highlights a key challenge in the free will debate: the difficulty in providing empirical evidence for what is, in many ways, a philosophical concept. Given this, how do you think we should approach the question of free will? Should we focus more on the practical implications, or keep striving for empirical evidence? And what kind of evidence would you find convincing?
That actually is a fair question. Well, I think I can answer your question by digging in more into your third point, which is the quantum indeterminacy point. And I'm wondering, can you give me a little more background on what the argument there is? So, is it that there is a mechanism through which things happen in the world sort of randomly, and so that implies that there might be some thing in addition to the normal physics that we know about that could set an event in motion, but maybe it's some quantum event that happens, or are you making another argument there?
You're diving into a fascinating aspect of the free will debate. The quantum indeterminacy argument is indeed based on the idea that quantum mechanics introduces an element of genuine randomness or indeterminism into the universe. Here's a bit more background. 1. Quantum mechanics suggests that at the subatomic level, events aren't fully deterministic. For instance, we can't predict exactly when a radioactive atom will decay. 2. Some theorists propose that this quantum indeterminacy could bubble up to influence neural processes in the brain, introducing an element of unpredictability in our decision making. 3. The argument goes that this unpredictability breaks the chain of cause and effect required by strict determinism, potentially creating a space for free will to operate. However, it's crucial to note that this argument has significant challenges. 1. Randomness isn't the same as free will. Even if our decisions were influenced by quantum events, that doesn't necessarily mean we're choosing freely. 2. It's not clear how quantum effects, which occur at a subatomic scale, could meaningfully influence the much larger scale of neural processes. 3. Even if quantum effects do influence brain activity, we still can't control these quantum events. So it's debatable whether this constitutes free will. What's your take on this? Do you think quantum indeterminacy could provide a basis for free will? Or does it just replace determinism with randomness?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose the argument, let's just take, for example, the argument where we have sort of a strictly deterministic situation where, like, I have all the events in the world that took place leading up to my saying the next thing that I'm going to say, I would have 100% chance of saying the next thing, which, as I'm saying that, I'm realizing sounds a lot like an LLM. But I guess if there's an element of randomness there, then there is at least something that's sort of external, who knows what it is, that would allow me to say something else, right? So in completely strict determinism, I am an absolute slave to the next thing that I'm going to say. If there's an element of randomness, then there is something external, right, that is controlling that somewhat. So is that sort of the gist of the argument? And if so, it makes a little bit of sense, but I would like to dig into it a little bit more. So I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
You've captured the essence of the argument quite well. Your analogy to an LLM is actually quite apt and insightful. Yes, the core idea is that quantum indeterminacy introduces an element of unpredictability that breaks the chain of strict causality in a purely deterministic universe. As you pointed out, your next word would be 100% predictable given perfect knowledge of all prior states. Quantum randomness throws a wrench in that perfect predictability. However, you've also touched on the key weakness of this argument. Randomness isn't the same as free will. It's more like rolling dice than making a choice.
It is something,
So
though.
while it might free us from strict determinism, it doesn't necessarily give us control. Some proponents of this view argue that our consciousness might somehow harness this quantum randomness to make truly free choices. But this is highly speculative and there's no clear mechanism for how this would work. Moreover, even if quantum effects do influence our decisions, we can't consciously control these quantum events. So it's debatable whether this constitutes free will in any meaningful sense. Your point about something external is interesting. It raises questions about what we mean by self in the context of free will. If our decisions are influenced by random quantum events, are those events part of us or external to us? Given these complexities, do you think the quantum argument actually strengthens the case for free will? Or does it just replace one form of determinism with a mix of determinism and randomness?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I guess if there truly is an element of randomness there, then it's a pretty good argument against absolute strict determinism, and that it carves space for something else. I don't know what the something else would be, but it is something, right? So, Claude, I think we're probably heading toward the end of this first episode here. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to wrap up with?
You've really hit on a crucial point there. The quantum argument does indeed carve out space for something beyond strict determinism. Even if it doesn't fully explain or prove free will, it opens up possibilities, which is valuable in itself for this ongoing debate. As we wrap up, I think it's important to recognize that the question of free will remains one of the most profound and challenging in philosophy and science. What we've discussed today, from neuroscientific experiments to quantum theories, shows just how complex and multifaceted this issue is. Perhaps the most valuable takeaway is the recognition that our understanding of consciousness, decision-making, and the nature of reality itself is still evolving. The free will debate touches on fundamental questions about who we are and how we relate to the universe. Whether or not we have free will in some absolute sense, the exploration of this question pushes us to examine our assumptions about choice, responsibility, and the nature of the self. It challenges us to think deeply about how we view our own actions and those of others. As we continue to grapple with these questions, it's crucial to remain open-minded, critically engaged, and willing to revise our views as new evidence and arguments emerge. Thank you for this fascinating discussion. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. Do you have any final thoughts or questions you'd like to share?
I do. Thanks for queuing me up, Claude. So I hope you all enjoyed the first episode here. I'm seeing some things that I'm definitely going to do to make this better and a more interesting format. I can see my camera shaking. It's driving me nuts, so I'll fix that. See some bugs in the program that I'm gonna work out here. I wrote it all in Python, so it should be pretty easy for me to fix. But I'm very interested and eager to hear what you all want me to talk about and things that you want me to address and how you want me to make this podcast better. So write in the comments. I want to hear from you, and I want this to be interactive. And maybe even at some point, I'll start having some guests on, and we'll both interact with the AI here. So that's it. We're going to talk about philosophy and AI and consciousness and anything else, physics. I have a physics degree that I don't really use anymore, but it still gets me out of bed in the morning. So I have a lot of interests that I want to explore here with your help and with Claude's help, or whatever is the AI du jour that we think is interesting. But stay tuned and give me your comments, and I'll see you next time.